Sometimes revenge is a dish best served cold, but sometimes it's better served with a side of corporate bankruptcy. I learned that lesson the hard way when I discovered just how much damage one insignificant employee could do when pushed too far. They thought firing me over a measly $500 mistake would be the end of the story. They were wrong. My name is Jessica Morgan, and I used to work at Pinnacle Strategic Solutions, a mid-sized consulting firm that specialized in corporate restructuring and financial optimization. For 3 years, I'd been their go-to analyst, the one who stayed late to fix everyone else's mistakes, who took on extra projects without complaint, and who had never once received a negative performance review. I was 28, ambitious, and foolishly loyal to a company that would throw me under the bus the moment it became convenient. It all started on a Tuesday morning in March. I was reviewing quarterly reports when my supervisor, Marcus Reed, stormed into my cubicle with a face redder than a stop sign. Marcus was one of those middle managers who compensated for his lack of actual skills by being as loud and aggressive as possible. He'd been promoted 2 years ago, despite having half my experience and a quarter of my work ethic. "Morgan, conference room, now," he barked, loud enough for the entire floor to hear. I followed him to the glass-walled conference room, where our department head, Patricia Blackwood, was already seated with a stack of papers in front of her. Patricia was a calculating woman in her early 50s who had climbed the corporate ladder by stepping on anyone who got in her way. She wore her ambition like expensive perfume, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. "Sit down, Jessica," Patricia said without looking up from her papers. Her voice carried that particular tone that made my stomach drop. "We need to discuss a serious error in your work." Marcus slammed a folder down on the table. "This expense report you submitted last month has a $500 discrepancy. You listed a client dinner at Romano's for $547, but the receipt shows $47. That's a $500 error, Morgan." I stared at the papers, my mind racing. "That's impossible. I always double-check my expense reports. Let me see the receipt." "The receipt is right here," Marcus said, pointing to a barely legible piece of paper. "And according to our records, you've been systematically inflating your expense reports for months." "That's not true," I protested, leaning forward to examine the receipt more closely. Something was off about it. The print quality was different, and the date looked like it had been altered. "This receipt has been tampered with. Look at the ink quality on the date versus the rest of the text." Patricia finally looked up, her cold grey eyes meeting mine. "Are you suggesting that someone in this company would fabricate evidence against you?" "That's a serious accusation, Jessica." "I'm suggesting that someone made an error, or this receipt was damaged and misread. I would never falsify an expense report. You've known me for 3 years. When have I ever been dishonest about anything?" Marcus leaned back in his chair with a smug expression. "The evidence speaks for itself. We've also discovered that you've been accessing client files outside of your assigned projects. That's a violation of company policy and client confidentiality." "What client files? I only access files relevant to my work. Everything I've accessed has been approved by project leads." "Not according to our IT logs," Patricia said, sliding another sheet across the table. "These show multiple unauthorized access attempts to high-level client databases." I looked at the computer logs, and my blood ran cold. Someone had been using my login credentials to access files I'd never touched. The timestamp showed activity during times when I wasn't even in the office, including a Sunday when I'd been at my sister's wedding in another state. "These aren't my activities," I said, my voice rising. "Someone has been using my login information. Check the security cameras for those dates. I wasn't even in the building for half of these." "The security footage from those dates was corrupted," Marcus said with a barely concealed smile. "Very convenient, don't you think?" The pieces were falling into place, and I realized I was being set up. But why? What had I done to warrant this level of elaborate deception? Then it hit me, the Morrison account. 3 weeks ago, I'd uncovered some irregularities in how Marcus was handling the Morrison Industries restructuring project. I'd noticed that several recommendations he'd made would have actually hurt the client's financial position while benefiting some of his personal investments. I'd kept quiet, thinking it was just incompetence, but now I wondered if it was something more sinister. "This is about Morrison Industries, isn't it?" I said, looking directly at Marcus. "You're trying to get rid of me because I found out about your recommendations." Marcus's face went pale for just a moment before he recovered. "I don't know what you're talking about. This is about your violations of company policy and fraudulent expense reports." Patricia stood up, smoothing her skirt. "Jessica, we've decided to terminate your employment effective immediately. Security will escort you out and you'll receive your final paycheck, minus the 500 discrepancy and any other irregularities we discover." "You can't fire me over fabricated evidence," I said, standing as well. "I'll fight this. I'll file a complaint with HR, with the State Labor Board, with whoever will listen." "Our HR department has already reviewed this case," Patricia said. "They agree with our decision, and I should mention that if you choose to make this difficult, we'll be forced to pursue criminal charges for fraud and theft." The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. I understood now that this wasn't just about getting rid of me. It was about destroying my reputation so thoroughly that I'd never work in this industry again. They wanted me not just gone, but silenced. Security arrived 5 minutes later, 2 guards who looked embarrassed to be there. They escorted me to my desk where I packed my personal belongings into a cardboard box while my colleagues watched in stunned silence. Some of them had worked with me for years, and I could see the confusion and sympathy in their eyes. As I walked toward the elevator, carrying my box of personal items, I caught sight of Marcus, watching from his office window. He raised his coffee mug in a mock toast, and I knew then that this had all been planned. Every detail, every piece of fabricated evidence, every procedural step had been carefully orchestrated to remove me from the picture. The elevator doors closed, and I found myself alone with my thoughts for the first time since this nightmare began. I was angry, devastated, and humiliated, but underneath all of that, I was beginning to feel something else, a cold, calculating fury that would soon become my greatest asset. I spent the next week in a daze, applying for jobs and dealing with the financial stress of sudden unemployment. But during that time, I was also thinking, planning and remembering everything I knew about Pinnacle Strategic Solutions. I'd been there for 3 years, and I'd worked on dozens of projects, handled sensitive client information, and observed the inner workings of a company that was far more corrupt than I'd ever imagined. The first thing I did was contact a lawyer. Janet Hoffman was a labor attorney who specialized in wrongful termination cases. She was a sharp woman in her 40s who listened to my story with the intensity of a hawk studying its prey. "They made several mistakes," she said after I'd finished explaining the situation. "First, they fired you without following proper progressive discipline procedures. Second, they threatened criminal charges without evidence. Third, they refused to let you properly defend yourself or examine the evidence against you." "But what about the fabricated evidence? The altered receipts and the computer logs?" "That's where things get interesting," Janet said, leaning back in her chair. "And if we can prove that evidence was fabricated, this goes from a wrongful termination case to a potential fraud case. Do you have any way to verify your whereabouts during those times when the computer logs show you accessing files?" I thought about it for a moment. The Sunday when I was supposedly accessing files, I was at my sister's wedding. There are photos, videos, dozens of witnesses. I can prove I was 200 miles away. "Perfect. What about the receipt?" "I always take photos of my receipts with my phone before submitting them. I should have the original photo." Janet smiled for the first time since I'd entered her office. "Then we have a case. But Jessica, I need to warn you, fighting this kind of corporate corruption can be expensive and time-consuming. They'll try to drag it out, hoping you'll give up or run out of money. I understand, but I can't let them destroy my career over lies. Good. I'll need you to document everything you can remember about your time at Pinnacle. Every project, every irregularity you observed, every conversation that seems suspicious. If this company is willing to fabricate evidence to fire one employee, they're probably hiding much bigger problems. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and began writing. I started with the Morrison Industries account and Marcus's suspicious recommendations. Then I moved on to other projects where I'd noticed irregularities. The Henderson merger, where numbers didn't add up. The coastal development restructuring that seemed designed to benefit Patricia's brother-in-law's construction company. The Meridian Holdings acquisition that had been rushed through without proper due diligence. As I wrote, patterns began to emerge. Pinnacle Strategic Solutions wasn't just a consulting firm. It was a sophisticated operation designed to manipulate corporate restructurings for the benefit of its executives and their personal investments. They'd been using their position as trusted advisors to insider trade, manipulate stock prices, and steer lucrative contracts to companies they had stakes in. The more I wrote, the angrier I became. I'd been so focused on doing good work and advancing my career that I'd missed the bigger picture. I'd been an unwitting accomplice to a massive fraud scheme, and when I'd gotten too close to the truth, they'd eliminated me. But I wasn't eliminated. I was just getting started. The next morning, I called my old college roommate, Diana Walsh. Diana worked as an investigative journalist for the Financial Tribune, and she'd been trying to convince me to give her inside information about corporate consulting firms for years. I'd always refused, citing professional ethics. Now then, those ethics now seem naive. Jessica, I heard about what happened. I'm so sorry. Those bastards really screwed you over. Diana, I need to ask you something. Are you still interested in that story about corporate consulting firms? There was a pause. What kind of story are we talking about? The kind that wins Pulitzer Prizes. I think I've been working for a company that's been systematically defrauding clients and manipulating markets for years. I'm listening. I spent the next hour outlining everything I'd remembered and documented. Diana took notes and asked pointed questions that helped me see even more connections I'd missed. This is huge, Jessica, but I need documentation, internal emails, project files, financial records. Do you have access to any of that? Not anymore. They cut off my access the moment they fired me. What about backups, cloud storage, anything you might have saved on personal devices? I thought about it. I always worked late, so I sometimes forwarded emails to my personal account so I could review them at home, and I might have some project files on my personal laptop that I was working on during my commute. Start gathering everything you can. I'll begin reaching out to my contacts at the SEC and other regulatory agencies. If what you're telling me is true, this could bring down the entire company. After hanging up with Diana, I felt a surge of excitement mixed with terror. I was about to declare war on a company with significant resources and political connections, but I was also about to expose a fraud scheme that had been stealing from clients and manipulating markets for years. I spent the rest of the day going through my personal email and laptop files. I found dozens of emails I'd forwarded to myself, project documents I'd worked on at home, and even some photos I'd taken of whiteboards during meetings. Each piece of evidence was like a puzzle piece, and slowly, the full picture of Pinnacle's corruption began to emerge. The Morrison Industries case was just the tip of the iceberg. I found evidence of insider trading based on confidential client information, recommendations designed to benefit Patricia's and Marcus's personal investments, kickbacks from contractors and service providers, manipulation of client financial reports to justify unnecessary restructuring, bid rigging on major consulting contracts, tax avoidance schemes that bordered on fraud. But the most damning evidence was a series of emails between Patricia and Marcus discussing how to handle me after I'd started asking questions about the Morrison account. The emails were coded, but the intent was clear. They'd planned to frame me and destroy my reputation to protect their operation. I was so absorbed in my investigation that I almost missed the knock at my door. When I opened it, I found a process server with a thick envelope. Jessica Morgan. Yes. You're being served with a cease and desist order and a civil lawsuit. My hands shook as I read the documents. Pinnacle Strategic Solutions was suing me for defamation, breach of contract, and theft of proprietary information. They were claiming that I'd been spreading false accusations about the company and its employees, and they were seeking $2 million in damages. The message was clear. Shut up or we'll destroy you financially. I called Janet immediately. They're trying to intimidate you, she said, after I'd read her the key portions of the lawsuit. This is a SLAP suit, strategic litigation against public participation. It's designed to silence you through legal intimidation. Can they win? Not if we fight back. But Jessica, this changes things. They're clearly desperate to keep you quiet, which means we're onto something big. Are you prepared to see this through to the end? I thought about Marcus's smug smile as I was escorted out of the building. I thought about Patricia's cold threats and the systematic way they'd destroyed my reputation. I thought about all the clients who'd been defrauded and the honest employees who had no idea they were working for criminals. I'm prepared, I said. What do we do next? We file a countersuit and we go on the offensive. It's time to show them what real evidence looks like. The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings, document preparation, and investigative work. Diana had connected me with a team of forensic accountants and data analysts who specialized in corporate fraud cases. We worked around the clock, building a comprehensive case that would expose the full scope of Pinnacle's criminal activities. The breakthrough came when we discovered that Marcus had been sloppy with his personal email security. He'd been using his work computer to access his personal Gmail account, and some of those emails had been automatically backed up to the company server. Through a legal discovery request, we were able to access messages that showed explicit coordination between Marcus, Patricia, and several outside parties in the fraud scheme. But the real goldmine was Patricia's financial records. As part of our countersuit, we were able to subpoena her bank records, investment accounts, and tax returns. What we found was staggering. Over the past 5 years, she'd made nearly $3 million in investment gains that perfectly correlated with confidential client information she'd accessed through her position at Pinnacle. The evidence was overwhelming, but I knew that exposing it would require careful timing and coordination. We needed to make sure that when we went public, we had everything documented and ready to present to regulators, prosecutors, and the media simultaneously. The opportunity came in July, 4 months after I'd been fired. Diana had arranged for a coordinated release of our findings to the SEC, the FBI's white-collar crime division, and the Financial Tribune. The story would break on a Tuesday morning, just as the stock market opened. The night before the story broke, I couldn't sleep. I sat on my couch, staring out at the city lights, thinking about how dramatically my life had changed. 4 months ago, I had been a loyal employee trying to do good work. Now I was about to bring down a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana. Story goes live in 6 hours. You ready for this? I typed back, ready. But I wasn't ready for what happened next. The Financial Tribune story hit the internet at 6 a.m. Eastern Time. The headline read, Exclusive. Internal documents reveal massive fraud scheme at Pinnacle Strategic Solutions. By 7 a.m., it had been picked up by every major financial news outlet. By 8 a.m., Pinnacle's stock price had dropped 40%. By 9 a.m., the FBI had raided Pinnacle's offices. I watched the news coverage from my apartment, feeling a mixture of vindication and shock. Footage showed federal agents carrying boxes of evidence out of the building where I'd worked for 3 years. Patricia and Marcus were led away in handcuffs, and the company's other executives were scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. But the real devastation was still to come. Over the next few days, the full scope of the damage became clear. 5 of Pinnacle's major clients, including Morrison Industries, Henderson Corp., Coastal Development, Meridian Holdings, and Apex Financial, filed lawsuits against the company for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. The combined value of these lawsuits exceeded $12 million. Morrison Industries was particularly aggressive in their legal response. They'd followed Marcus's recommendations and restructured their operations in ways that had cost them millions of dollars and hundreds of jobs. When they discovered that Marcus had been shorting their stock while advising them to make decisions that would tank their share price, they filed both civil and criminal complaints. The Henderson merger that I'd flagged as suspicious was revealed to be a complete sham. Patricia had been secretly working with Henderson's competitors to sabotage the deal, allowing them to acquire Henderson's assets at a fraction of their actual value. The financial damage to Henderson's shareholders was estimated at over $4 million. Coastal Development discovered that Patricia's brother-in-law's construction company had been awarded millions of dollars in contracts based on fraudulent recommendations. The FBI's investigation revealed that Patricia had been taking kickbacks on every contract, and the construction work had been systematically overpriced and underdelivered. The Meridian Holdings acquisition had been rushed through without proper due diligence because Patricia and Marcus had inside information about a lawsuit that would have tanked the deal. They'd shorted Meridian's stock and profited from the acquisition's inevitable failure. Even Apex Financial, which had seemed like a legitimate success story, was revealed to be part of the fraud scheme. Pinnacle had been manipulating Apex's financial reports to justify massive consulting fees while secretly steering the company toward bankruptcy so that Patricia and Marcus could profit from credit default swaps. The media coverage was relentless. Every day brought new revelations about the scope of the fraud scheme, and my role as the whistleblower made me a central figure in the story. I gave interviews to major news outlets, testified before congressional committees, and spoke at conferences about corporate fraud and whistleblower protections. But the personal cost was higher than I'd expected. I received death threats from people who'd lost money when Pinnacle's stock collapsed. I was followed by private investigators hired by the company's lawyers. My apartment was broken into twice. Though nothing was stolen, it was clearly meant as intimidation. The legal battle dragged on for months. Pinnacle's lawyers threw everything they had at me, trying to discredit my testimony and painting me as a disgruntled employee who'd fabricated evidence. But our case was too strong, and eventually, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Marcus was the first to crack. Facing 20 years in federal prison, he agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony provided the final pieces of evidence needed to prove the conspiracy charges against Patricia and several other executives. Patricia held out longer, but when the FBI discovered offshore accounts containing over $5 million in fraudulent proceeds, she finally agreed to plead guilty to multiple felony charges. She was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $8 million in restitution to the defrauded clients. Pinnacle Strategic Solutions filed for bankruptcy 6 months after the story broke. The company that had employed over 200 people and managed billions of dollars in client assets was completely destroyed. The 5 major clients I'd helped expose were eventually made whole through the bankruptcy proceedings, and insurance settlements, but dozens of smaller clients lost everything. The personal vindication was sweet, but it came with a cost I hadn't fully anticipated. I'd won the war, but I'd also destroyed an entire company and put hundreds of innocent employees out of work. The guilt kept me awake at night, even though I knew I'd done the right thing. Janet's wrongful termination lawsuit was settled out of court for $1.2 million, more money than I'd ever imagined having. The settlement included a clause requiring Pinnacle to issue a public apology and acknowledgement that the evidence against me had been fabricated. Diana won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigative reporting on the Pinnacle scandal. She used her acceptance speech to highlight the importance of whistleblower protections and the courage it takes to expose corporate corruption. A year later, I started my own consulting firm, specializing in corporate compliance and fraud prevention. My experience at Pinnacle had taught me how to spot the warning signs of corporate corruption, and companies were eager to hire someone who'd proven they couldn't be bought or intimidated. My first client was Morrison Industries. They hired me to review their internal controls and make recommendations for preventing future fraud. It was satisfying to help clean up the mess that Marcus had created and to see the company recover from the damage that had been inflicted on them. But the real satisfaction came from knowing that I'd held powerful people accountable for their crimes. Marcus, Patricia, and 3 other Pinnacle executives were serving federal prison sentences. The fraud scheme that had stolen millions from clients and manipulated markets for years had been exposed and destroyed. I kept the newspaper clipping from the day the story broke. The headline still gave me chills. Exclusive, internal documents reveal massive fraud scheme at Pinnacle Strategic Solutions. Under it was a smaller headline that I particularly enjoyed. Whistleblower. Fired over $500 error, exposes $12 million fraud. They'd fired me over a fabricated $500 error, thinking they could intimidate me into silence. Instead, they'd unleash someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by exposing the truth. The $500 error had cost them $12 million in lawsuits, 5 major clients, their company, their freedom, and their reputations. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if they'd just let me quit quietly when I started asking questions about the Morrison account. If they'd handled the situation with even a minimal amount of professionalism and honesty, I might have left Pinnacle and never looked back. Their entire criminal enterprise could have continued operating for years. But they chose to destroy me instead, and in doing so, they gave me both the motivation and the moral authority to destroy them. They turned an ethical employee into a determined enemy, and they paid the ultimate price for that mistake. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd accused me of stealing $500 and fired me for being dishonest. In the end, I'd cost them millions of dollars by being completely honest about their crimes. They'd tried to destroy my reputation by calling me a thief and a liar. Instead, I'd become known as someone who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or silenced. Late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I sometimes thought about Marcus raising his coffee mug in that mocking toast as I was escorted out of the building. I wondered if he ever thought about that moment during his first year in federal prison. I wondered if he realized that his moment of petty triumph had been the beginning of his downfall. But mostly, I slept well. I'd learned that revenge isn't about getting even, it's about getting justice, and sometimes justice comes with a price tag of $12 million and a 15-year prison sentence. The best part was that I'd done it all completely legally and ethically. I hadn't fabricated evidence or made false accusations. I'd simply told the truth about what I'd observed and documented. The system had worked exactly as it was supposed to, and the criminals had been held accountable for their crimes. 3 years later, I was testifying before Congress about the need for stronger whistleblower protections when a reporter asked me if I regretted my decision to expose Pinnacle's fraud scheme. The only thing I regret, I said, is that it took me so long to realize what was happening. If I'd been more observant, more willing to question authority, I might have been able to stop the fraud before it cost clients so much money. Do you think your experience will deter other employees from speaking up about corporate corruption? I thought about the question for a moment. I hope it will encourage them. Yes, there are risks to being a whistleblower, but there are also risks to staying silent. When you work for criminals, you're never really safe because criminals will always prioritize their own interests over their employees' well-being. What would you say to someone who's discovered evidence of fraud at their company but is afraid to come forward? I'd say that the truth has a way of coming out eventually. You can either be part of exposing it, or you can be part of covering it up. One choice makes you a hero, and the other makes you an accomplice. After the hearing, I walked out of the Capitol building into the bright afternoon sun. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana. Great testimony. Drinks later to celebrate? I texted back, absolutely, I've got a lot to celebrate. And I did. I'd gone from being a fired employee with a fabricated $500 error on my record to being a respected expert on corporate fraud prevention. I'd exposed a massive criminal conspiracy, helped recover millions of dollars for defrauded clients, and sent several criminals to prison where they belonged. But the thing I was most proud of was that I'd done it all by simply refusing to be intimidated. When they tried to silence me with fabricated evidence and legal threats, I'd responded with documentation and truth. When they tried to destroy my reputation, I'd let my actions speak for themselves. The $500 error they'd used to fire me had been completely fabricated, but the $12 million in damage I'd caused to their criminal enterprise was absolutely real. They'd gambled that they could destroy one honest employee to protect their fraud scheme. They'd lost that gamble, and they'd lost everything. Sometimes revenge really is a dish best served cold, but sometimes it's even better served with a side of justice and a federal prison sentence.